They had been drilled from the very first moments of their military training that surrender was not just a failure, but an unforgivable sin against the emperor, the nation, and their own souls. Capture meant the end of honor, a descent into a hell where the enemy would unleash unimaginable torments to break their spirits and extract secrets that could never be given. For the Japanese soldiers who found themselves prisoners of war in the hands of the Americans during World War II, the stories they had heard painted a vivid picture of barbarity. Beatings that left men crippled, starvation that reduced warriors to skeletons, humiliations designed to strip away every last shred of dignity until death seemed like a merciful release. They were told that the Americans, those decadent Westerners with their machines and their bombs, had no respect for the Bushido Code, no understanding of the sacred duty to fight until the last breath. Instead, they would treat captives like animals, caged and prodded for sport. So when the first groups of Japanese POWs were transported across the vast Pacific to camps on American soil in 1943 and 1944, each man steeled himself for the worst. They whispered prayers to their ancestors, clutched hidden blades in case the opportunity arose for seppuku, and vowed silently that they would reveal nothing, endure everything, and die with their loyalty intact. But as the trains rattled through the unfamiliar landscapes of the United States, carrying them toward places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, or other facilities scattered across the Midwest and beyond, the reality that awaited them would shatter those expectations in ways no amount of propaganda could have prepared them for. It wasn't torture that broke them. It was the unexpected humanity, the routines of decency, and most shockingly of all, the simple act of being fed like human beings, with hamburgers sizzling on grills and bottles of Coca-Cola fizzing open in the crisp air. This was not the war they knew. This was something altogether different, a confrontation with an enemy who fought not just with weapons, but with an abundance that challenged everything they believed. The journey to these camps was itself a trial that reinforced their fears. Captured on distant battlefields like Guadalcanal, Attu, or the Marshall Islands, the soldiers had often endured grueling interrogations at forward bases, where rough handling and sparse rations were the norm. Then came the long sea voyages on crowded ships, where the sway of the ocean mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies and the constant hum of engines. Many arrived in America weakened by malaria, dysentery, or wounds that had festered in the tropical heat. As the trains pulled them deeper into the heartland, the men peered through slatted windows at endless fields of corn and wheat, towns with neat houses and children waving from porches, a landscape so alien and prosperous that it seemed like a dream or a trap. Whispers spread among them, this must be a facade, a way to lull them into complacency before the real horrors began. One soldier, a young private from Tokyo named Hiroshi Tanaka, remembered later how he had gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white, repeating to himself the imperial rescript that demanded death over dishonor. He had seen comrades choose suicide grenades rather than capture, and now he wondered if he had made the wrong choice by allowing himself to be taken alive. The train's whistle pierced the air as it slowed, and the doors slid open to reveal a world blanketed in snow, the cold biting like 1,000 tiny knives through their threadbare uniforms. Stepping off at Camp McCoy in the winter of 1944, the prisoners formed ragged lines under the watchful eyes of American guards. The camp sprawled across the Wisconsin countryside, a collection of wooden barracks, mess halls, and administrative buildings encircled by barbed wire fences and guard towers. Snowflakes swirled in the wind, sticking to eyelashes and beards, and the men shivered uncontrollably, unaccustomed to such frigid temperatures after years in the steamy Pacific. They expected the guards to descend upon them with clubs or rifle butts, shouting insults in that guttural English language that sounded like barking dogs. Instead, the commands came firmly but without malice. "Line up, move forward," interpreters, often Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, relayed the orders in calm, precise Japanese, their accents a strange mix of familiarity and foreignness that unnerved the prisoners even more. Who were these men, speaking their tongue yet wearing the enemy's uniform? Traitors, perhaps, or illusions meant to deceive? As they marched toward the intake area, Hiroshi noticed the Red Cross representatives standing off to the side, clad in neutral uniforms with clipboards in hand, observing everything with impartial eyes. Back in Japan, the propaganda had dismissed the Geneva Convention as a Western lie, a paper shield that meant nothing in the face of real power. Yet here it was, embodied in these outsiders who seemed to hold authority even over the Americans. One prisoner, a sergeant named Kenji Yamamoto, muttered under his breath to the man beside him, "This must be for show. They'll wait until the observers leave, then the beatings will start. His companion nodded grimly, eyes darting to the rifles slung over the guards' shoulders. The intake process unfolded with an efficiency that bordered on the mechanical, but it was laced with acts of care that left the men reeling. First came the delousing stations, where they were stripped of their infested clothing, uniforms caked with mud, blood, and the grime of battle, and sprayed with powders that stung their skin but promised relief from the constant itch of parasites. Their old garments were burned in great pyres, the smoke rising like funeral offerings into the gray sky. Naked and vulnerable, they stood in lines, expecting mockery or worse. But the American medics handled them with professional detachment, issuing clean undergarments and simple robes to cover themselves. Medical examinations followed. Doctors listened to hearts with stethoscopes, probed for infections, and bandaged wounds that had been ignored for weeks. Hiroshi had a gash on his leg from shrapnel, infected and throbbing. He braced for rough treatment, perhaps even amputation as punishment. Instead, a young medic cleaned it gently with antiseptic, applied a salve that cooled the burn, and wrapped it in fresh gauze. "This will heal fine," the medic said through the interpreter. His tone matter-of-fact, as if tending to an enemy was no different from caring for his own. Hiroshi sat there, stunned, unable to process the kindness. Why waste resources on a prisoner? Was it a ploy to gain trust? To make him spill military secrets later? He whispered to Kenji, who was next in line. "They're fattening us like pigs for slaughter." Kenji, his own arm being examined for a fracture, replied softly. "Or perhaps they don't see us as threats anymore." That would be worse. As the day wore on, the prisoners were registered. Names, ranks, serial numbers, recorded in ledgers and assigned to barracks. The march across the camp yard was a silent procession, snow crunching under boots that were too thin for the climate. The barracks loomed ahead, sturdy structures with tin roofs and chimneys, puffing smoke that carried the faint scent of burning wood. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave, stoves crackling in the corners, bunks lined with mattresses and piled with wool blankets. It wasn't luxury, but after months of sleeping on jungle floors or in foxholes riddled with rain, it felt almost decadent. The men hesitated at the thresholds, as if stepping inside would seal some unspoken pact. One older prisoner, a farmer from rural Kyoto, named Takeshi Nakamura, sank onto a bunk, his calloused hands running over the blanket's rough weave. "This can't be real," he murmured, his voice thick with disbelief. "We are captives, not guests." The guards explained the rules through interpreters. Lights out at a certain hour, no gatherings without permission, work details to come. But there were no threats of violence, no promises of pain. Instead, they mentioned mail privileges, letters home, censored but allowed, and access to a canteen for small purchases. The prisoners exchanged glances, suspicion etching deeper lines into their faces. Takeshi thought of his wife and children back home, scraping by on rationed rice and foraged roots. How could he write to them from a place like this without feeling like a traitor? That first night in the barracks, as the wind howled outside and the stoves popped with heat, the men lay awake, their minds racing. Conversations were hushed, fragmented, laced with the fear that walls had ears. Hiroshi stared at the ceiling beams, tracing the knots in the wood with his eyes. He remembered the Imperial Army's lectures. The Americans are beasts. They will chain you, starve you, force you to beg. But so far there were no chains, only the invisible ones of uncertainty. Kenji in the bunk above leaned down and whispered, "Do you smell that?" from the kitchens. Indeed, a rich aroma wafted through the cracks in the walls. Meaty, savory, nothing like the thin gruel they had subsisted on during transport. Stomachs growled in unison, a chorus of betrayal from bodies that refused to forget hunger. "It's a test," someone else said from across the room. "They want to see if we'll break for food." The group fell silent, each man wrestling with his own demons. For Takeshi, the warmth of the blanket was a double-edged sword. It eased his aching bones, but stirred guilt for those left behind in the cold grip of war. As sleep finally claimed them, fitful and dream-haunted, they could not shake the sense that the real battle was just beginning. Not with fists or bayonets, but with the slow erosion of everything they had been taught to believe. The following morning dawned with a bugle call that echoed across the camp, a sound eerily similar to the reveille in their own Japanese barracks back home. It jolted the prisoners upright, hearts pounding, expecting a raid or punishment detail. Instead, it was the signal for roll call, conducted in the crisp dawn light with guards counting heads and interpreters calling names. No one was missing, no one dared to be. After that, they were herded toward a large assembly hall for orientation. A Red Cross official, a Swiss man with a neutral accent, stood at the front, flanked by American officers. Through the interpreter, he outlined their rights under the Geneva Convention: protection from violence, adequate food and shelter, medical care, the ability to correspond with family, and fair treatment in work assignments. The words hung in the air like foreign incantations, met with skeptical stares and murmured doubts. Rights for prisoners? Kenji scoffed under his breath to Hiroshi. What rights do the defeated have? This is mockery, the official continued, explaining that neutral inspectors would visit regularly to ensure compliance, that complaints could be lodged without fear of reprisal. One prisoner, bolder than the rest, raised a hand and asked through the interpreter, "Why do you tell us this? Are we not your enemies?" The official paused, then replied evenly, "The convention binds all signatories, including the United States. War has rules, even for enemies." The room buzzed with confusion. In the Pacific Theater, rules had seemed as fragile as paper in a storm. Medical checks resumed after the briefing, more detailed this time. Scales measured weights that shocked even the Americans. Many prisoners tipped the balance at under 100 pounds, their frames skeletal from months of deprivation. Vitamins were distributed, small pills that the men eyed warily before swallowing. "To build you up," a nurse said kindly, her smile disarming in its sincerity. Hiroshi took his feeling the chalky texture on his tongue, wondering if it was poison disguised as aid. Fresh uniforms followed, sturdy pants and shirts stamped with PW in bold letters, boots that fit properly, coats to ward off the Wisconsin chill. Slipping into the new clothes, Takeshi felt a pang of loss for his old uniform. Tattered as it was, it had been a symbol of his duty, now replaced by the mark of captivity. The guards, meanwhile, maintained a vigilant but not vicious presence. When one prisoner slipped on the icy path leading back to the barracks, a guard extended a hand to help him up, grunting, "Easy there" in English. The prisoner, a corporal named Akira Sato, pulled away instinctively, but the gesture lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. By afternoon, work details were assigned: shoveling snow, chopping wood, simple tasks that kept the camp running. The prisoners labored under supervision, their breaths fogging in the cold air, expecting the whips of overseers or endless hours without break. Instead, the guards enforced pace but allowed rests, even sharing thermos of hot coffee on particularly bitter days. "Drink," one guard said, pouring a cup for Akira. The bitter liquid warmed him from the inside, a comfort he hadn't known since leaving Japan. Back in the barracks that evening, as the men gathered around the stove, discussions turned heated. "They're trying to make us forget who we are," Akira argued, his voice low. "Coffee, blankets, it's all to soften us." Hiroshi nodded, but Takeshi, older and warier, countered, "Or perhaps they simply don't need to torture us. We're already broken by being here." The smell from the kitchens grew stronger as dinner approached, teasing their senses with promises of substance. Stomachs long accustomed to emptiness, twisted in anticipation. Little did they know that the mess hall would deliver the most profound shock yet, a meal that would challenge not just their bodies, but their very understanding of the enemy. The line for the mess hall snaked out the door, the prisoners clutching trays with hands numb from the cold. Steam billowed from the serving area, carrying scents that were intoxicating and intimidating. The sizzle of meat on griddles, the earthy fry of potatoes, the sweet tang of something unfamiliar. They had expected slop, watery soup, moldy bread, portions doled out to keep them barely alive. Instead, as the first men reached the counter, the American cooks piled food onto their trays with generous scoops. A thick hamburger patty, juicy and browned, nestled in a soft bun. Golden French fries heaped beside it, and then the crowning oddity, a bottle of Coca-Cola, its glass beaded with condensation. The cap popped with a hiss that echoed like gunfire. Hiroshi, third in line, watched as Kenji received his portion, the older sergeant's eyes widening in disbelief. "What is this?" Kenji whispered, lifting the bottle to inspect the bubbling dark liquid. The guard nearby chuckled and said through the interpreter, "It's Coke. Drink it. It's good for you." The men shuffled to the long tables, sitting in clusters, staring at their trays as if they held live grenades. Tentatively, they began to eat. Takeshi bit into the hamburger first, the grease coating his lips, the flavors exploding on his tongue. Savory beef, soft bread, a hint of onion and pickle that he couldn't identify but craved instantly. Tears pricked his eyes unbidden. He hadn't tasted meat like this since before the war, when his family could afford a rare treat. Beside him, Akira sipped the Coca-Cola, the carbonation fizzing up his nose, the sweetness so intense it made him cough, then laugh, a sound that startled the table into silence. "It's like liquid candy," he gasped, wiping his mouth. Whispers spread, "They're feeding us like kings." No, like their own soldiers. For men who had survived on handfuls of rice and scavenged roots, who had watched comrades waste away from beriberi and starvation, this meal was a revelation and an insult. How could the enemy afford such extravagance? Hiroshi chewed slowly, each bite a mix of pleasure and pain. Pleasure for his starving body, pain for the propaganda that crumbled with every swallow. "If this is torture," someone joked weakly, "then let it continue." But beneath the humor lay deeper turmoil. The realization that their captors saw them not as subhuman, but as men worthy of sustenance. As trays emptied and bottles drained, the mess hall filled with a mix of sounds, chewing, sighs of contentment, occasional sobs muffled into sleeves. The Americans ate the same food at adjacent tables, chatting casually about baseball or home leave, their normalcy a stark contrast to the prisoners' inner chaos. One guard noticed a prisoner struggling with the fizz and demonstrated how to drink it slowly, a small act that bridged the divide for a moment. Back in the barracks that night, the men lay replete for the first time in months. But sleep was elusive. "I feel like a traitor for enjoying it," Kenji admitted in the dark. Takeshi replied, "Enjoyment or survival? The line blurs here." The hamburger and Coca-Cola became symbols that night, not just of food, but of a world turned upside down, where kindness from the enemy cut deeper than any blade. The routines of camp life settled in like a fog, enveloping the prisoners in a daily rhythm that was both comforting and confining. Mornings began with roll call and the pre-dawn chill, names echoing across the yard as guards ticked off lists. Breakfast followed, oatmeal, eggs, bread with butter, simple but nourishing, a far cry from the meager portions they remembered from their own army camps. Work details varied. Some groups maintained the campgrounds, raking leaves or repairing fences. Others were transported to nearby farms to help with harvests, their labor compensated with scrip redeemable at the canteen. The guards supervised closely, rifles at the ready. But there were no arbitrary punishments, no forced marches to exhaustion. Hiroshi found himself on a wood-chopping crew, swinging an axe alongside fellow prisoners, the rhythmic thuds a reminder of physical strength returning to his limbs. "They're using us," he grumbled to Akira during a break. "But at least they're not killing us." Akira, wiping sweat from his brow, nodded. "And the pay enough for soap or paper. In Japan, we fought for honor alone." The canteen was a revelation in itself, stocked with items that seemed luxurious. Toothpaste, razor blades, chocolate bars, packs of chewing gum. Takeshi used his first earnings to buy a bar of chocolate, unwrapping it slowly in the barracks, savoring the melt on his tongue. This was for the elite back home, he said, sharing pieces with his bunkmates. The act fostered a fragile camaraderie, but it also sparked debates. Some prisoners refused to spend, viewing it as collaboration. Others embraced the small comforts, arguing that survival demanded adaptation. English classes in the evenings drew a mix of attendees, curious souls like Hiroshi, who repeated words like hello and thank you, and skeptics who listened from afar. The teacher, a patient civilian volunteer, used pictures to illustrate a drawing of a house-prompted home, evoking wistful sighs. One class, when the word family was taught, a prisoner pulled out a crumpled photo of his wife, holding it up silently. The teacher nodded, understanding, and for a brief moment the room transcended language barriers. Interactions with guards evolved subtly. Not all were friendly. Some maintained a cold distance, their eyes hard with unspoken grudges from lost friends in the Pacific. But others, like a young private named Johnson from Iowa, showed curiosity. During a farm detail, Johnson asked through an interpreter about Japanese food. "Do you miss rice?" he inquired. Kenji, hoeing soil, replied curtly, "Rice is life." Johnson later brought a small bag of it from the kitchens, handing it over with a shrug. "Thought you might like it." The gesture stunned Kenji. He cooked it that evening, the familiar aroma bringing tears. "Why?" he asked Hiroshi later. "To make us indebted?" Hiroshi pondered. "Or because he's human, like us?" Such moments chipped away at walls, but tensions flared too. Arguments in the barracks turned physical one night when a prisoner accused another of going American for attending classes. Guards intervened, separating them without violence, but the rift lingered. Letters home were lifelines and burdens. Allowed 2 per month, the men labored over words, censoring themselves to avoid alarming families. Takeshi wrote of adequate conditions, omitting the abundance that shamed him. Replies, when they came, spoke of bombings, shortages, lost loved ones, stark contrasts that deepened guilt. My sister died in a raid, Akira read aloud one day, his voice breaking. The group fell silent, the warmth of the barracks feeling like mockery. Yet amid the monotony, small joys emerged. Improvised games with handmade cards, stories shared in circles, even songs hummed softly. The camp's chapel hosted services. A few prisoners attended out of curiosity, finding solace in the ritual if not the faith. As winter deepened, snow piling high, the prisoners adapted, their bodies filling out, their minds grappling with the paradox of humane captivity. But the contradictions gnawed relentlessly. Every meal in the mess hall, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie, reminded them of home's deprivations. We eat better than the emperor's court, joked one man, but the laughter was hollow. Propaganda sessions back in Japan had depicted America as starving, yet here abundance flowed. Red Cross inspections reinforced the rules, officials noting complaints about minor issues like drafty windows, treating them seriously. They listen, Takeshi marveled, as if we matter. Envy burned when work crews saw American farms teeming with livestock, machinery humming wealth unimaginable. One day a child from a nearby town approached the fence, offering cookies baked by her mother. Akira took one, bowing deeply, the sweetness mingling with bitterness. Her father might have killed mine, he thought, yet the innocence disarmed him. As 1945 dawned, rumors of the war's tide turning filtered in. Losses in Iwo Jima, firebombings of Tokyo. The prisoners debated in whispers, loyalty demanded belief in victory, but evidence mounted against it. If Japan falls, Hiroshi confided, what then for us? The question hung unanswered, the camp's order a fragile shield against the storm outside. The whispers of war's end grew louder in the spring of 1945, carried on the wind that swept through Camp McCoy's barbed wire fences. The prisoners felt it in the guarded glances of the American sentries, heard it in the clipped conversations of Red Cross officials, and saw it in the newspapers that occasionally fluttered into view. Their bold English headlines incomprehensible but heavy with implication. Japan was faltering, cities burned, fleets sank, and the empire's once invincible spirit seemed to crack under the weight of Allied bombs. Inside the camp, the Japanese prisoners grappled with these fragments of news, their hearts torn between loyalty to a homeland they could no longer reach and the strange reality of their lives behind the wire. They had expected torture, starvation, or death when they first arrived. Instead, they had been met with hamburgers, Coca-Cola, and an orderliness that felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught about the enemy. Now, as the war hurtled toward its cataclysmic end, the contradictions of their captivity deepened, forcing them to confront questions of honor, survival, and what it meant to return to a nation that might no longer recognize them. Life in the camp continued its relentless rhythm, as if the world outside could be held at bay by routine. Each morning, the bugle's sharp notes pierced the dawn, pulling the men from their bunks for roll call. Hiroshi Tanaka stood shoulder to shoulder with Kenji Yamamoto and Takeshi Nakamura, their breaths fogging in the Wisconsin chill as guards checked names against lists. The process was mechanical, predictable, yet it never failed to remind them of their status. Prisoners, not soldiers, their fates dictated by the enemy's pen. Breakfast followed, trays laden with pancakes or scrambled eggs, coffee steaming in tin mugs. The abundance no longer shocked them as it had in those first weeks, but it still carried a sting. Hiroshi chewed his food slowly, each bite a reminder of the rice his family might be scraping from near-empty bowls back in Tokyo. I write to them of health, he confessed to Takeshi one morning, his voice low, but how can I speak of this? He gestured at the plate, the butter melting into golden pools. Takeshi, his eyes heavy with the weight of his own letters home, only nodded. We live better than they do, that's the wound we carry. Work details filled the days, a mix of mundane tasks that kept the camp humming, and outings to nearby farms where prisoners helped with planting or harvesting under watchful eyes. The labor was not brutal, but it was constant, a reminder that freedom was a distant memory. Kenji, swinging a hoe in a potato field, found a strange comfort in the physicality of it, his muscles regaining strength lost to months of hunger in the Pacific. Yet the sight of American farmers with their tractors and overflowing barns gnawed at him. They have so much, he muttered to Akira Sato, who worked beside him, and we thought they were the ones starving. Akira, his hands caked with soil, gave a bitter laugh. Propaganda lied to us, but so did our pride. We believed we were the center of the world. The guards, ever present, rarely intervened unless a prisoner strayed too far from the group. One day, a young guard named Peterson tossed a pack of cigarettes to Kenji during a break, a casual gesture that left the sergeant frozen. "Take it," Peterson said through the interpreter, shrugging. Kenji pocketed the pack, but later, in the barracks, he tore it open and crushed the cigarettes under his heel. "I won't owe them anything," he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. The camp canteen remained a focal point of both temptation and tension. With their small wages from work details, prisoners could buy soap, writing paper, or treats like candy bars and gum. Takeshi, practical by nature, spent his scrip on pencils and paper, scribbling letters to his wife in Kyoto, each word chosen to obscure the comfort of his captivity. "I am cared for," he wrote, avoiding details that might shame his family, who survived on whatever scraps the war hadn't claimed. Others, like Akira, indulged in small luxuries, a chocolate bar shared among bunkmates, the sweetness of fleeting escape from guilt. But the canteen also sparked arguments. Some prisoners, clinging to their imperial ideals, saw every purchase as a step toward betrayal. "You're eating their food, wearing their clothes, buying their candy," one man accused during a heated barracks debate. "What's left of us?" Akira shot back. "We're alive, aren't we? Or would you rather we died for honor and left our families to bury us?" The words hung heavy, unanswered, as the men turned away from each other, their unity fraying under the pressure of survival. English classes continued to draw a mix of attendees, with Hiroshi among the regulars, his curiosity outweighing his suspicion. The volunteer teacher, a woman named Miss Evans with a gentle voice, used flashcards and simple phrases to bridge the gap. "Friend," she said one evening, holding up a picture of two men shaking hands. Hiroshi repeated the word, his tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar syllables, but the concept stirred something in him. He thought of the guard, Johnson, who had shared rice, or the medic who had bandaged his leg without a sneer. Were these acts friendship, or something less definable? Across the room, a prisoner scoffed, muttering about enemy tricks, but Hiroshi noticed how even the skeptics leaned in slightly, ears catching the rhythm of the language. Outside the classroom, small exchanges with guards grew more frequent. During a work detail, Peterson pointed at a flock of birds overhead and said, "Geese." Hiroshi, catching the word, repeated it softly, earning a grin. These moments were fleeting, but they accumulated like snowflakes, layering over the prisoner's distrust with something softer, harder to name. Religion offered another unexpected bridge. The camp chapel, a simple wooden structure, hosted Christian services that some prisoners attended out of curiosity or a need for warmth. Takeshi, raised in Shinto traditions, sat one Sunday in the back, watching as an American chaplain spoke of forgiveness and hope. The words, translated haltingly, felt foreign, but the act of gathering in reverence was familiar, like prayers to ancestors in a Kyoto shrine. "Their gods are different," he told Hiroshi later, "but their hearts reach for the same things." Others rejected the chapel outright, viewing it as another trap to erode their loyalty. In the barracks, hushed circles formed at night where prisoners recited Buddhist sutras or prayed to kami, clinging to rituals that anchored them to home. Yet even these moments were tinged with doubt. How could they pray for victory when defeat loomed closer with each passing day? The Red Cross inspections, conducted monthly, reinforced the camp's adherence to rules that still baffled the prisoners. Neutral officials walked the grounds, checking barracks for warmth, kitchens for nutrition, and infirmaries for supplies. They asked the men directly, through interpreters, "Are you treated well? Do you have complaints?" Most answered cautiously, aware of the guard's presence. But the truth slipped through. Yes, the food was sufficient. Yes, the medical care was prompt. Yes, the blankets kept out the cold. Afterward, in the privacy of the barracks, shame crept in. "We admit they treat us fairly," Kenji said one night, his voice tight. "While our own people starve under bombs. What does that make us?" No one replied, but the question lingered like smoke, curling into their thoughts. The inspections also brought moments of humanity that cut deeper than expected. During one visit, a Swiss official noticed a prisoner's worn boots and insisted they be replaced. By evening, new ones arrived, sturdy and warm. The prisoner, a quiet man named Daiichi, stared at them, then wept silently, overwhelmed not by the boots but by the care behind them. Food remained the camp's most powerful weapon, wielded without malice but with devastating effect. The mess hall served meals that continued to astonish. Roast beef with gravy, mashed potatoes, apple pie with a scoop of ice cream that melted into a sweet puddle. The prisoners, their bodies slowly filling out, ate with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Hiroshi, savoring a slice of pie one evening, remembered his mother's stories of scraping sugar from the family's rations to make a rare treat. Here sugar was everywhere, sprinkled on desserts, fizzing in Coca-Cola, offered without thought. They don't even notice it, he marveled to Akira, who nodded, sipping his soda. It's ordinary to them, like rice was to us before the war. The normalcy of the abundance was what shook them most. The Americans didn't taunt or gloat, they simply ate, served, and moved on, as if feeding prisoners well was as routine as cleaning their rifles. For men who had survived on roots and rainwater in the jungles, this was a quiet assault on their worldview, a reminder that their enemy lived in a reality where scarcity was a choice, not a necessity. Moments of connection with the outside world pierced the camp's isolation. Children from nearby towns sometimes gathered at the fence, their curiosity overcoming their parents' warnings. One afternoon, a girl with pigtails tossed an apple over the wire to Takeshi, who caught it reflexively. "Eat," she called, her voice bright. He hesitated, then bit into it, the crisp sweetness flooding his senses. He bowed, a gesture of thanks that felt inadequate, and the girl ran off giggling. That night, he wrote in his diary, "A child's kindness is sharper than a bayonet. I cannot hate her, and that frightens me." Such encounters were rare but potent, each one chipping away at the propaganda that had painted Americans as monsters. Even the guards, despite their sternness, showed flashes of humanity. Johnson, the Iowa private, began bringing a harmonica to his shifts, playing simple tunes during breaks. The prisoners listened, some tapping their feet unconsciously, the music a universal language that needed no translation. Yet suspicion never fully faded. In the barracks, arguments flared over loyalty and adaptation. Some prisoners, hardened by imperial doctrine, accused others of softening, of forgetting their duty to the emperor. "You laugh with them, you learn their words," one man shouted at Hiroshi after an English class. "Do you think this makes you less a prisoner?" Hiroshi, his patience worn thin, snapped back. "I'm learning to survive, not to betray. What good is honor if we're dead?" The tension simmered, splitting the men into factions, those who clung to defiance and those who quietly began to see their captors as men, not demons. Takeshi, ever the mediator, urged calm. "We're not here to become American," he said. "We're here to live long enough to go home." But home felt farther away with each letter that arrived, describing air raids, hunger, and loss. By summer, the war's end was no longer a rumor but a certainty. Newspapers smuggled glimpses of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, words like atomic bomb whispered in tones of awe and horror. When Japan's surrender was announced in August 1945, the camp fell into a stunned silence. Some prisoners wept openly, their dreams of victory shattered. Others sat motionless, staring at the barbed wire as if it had become a cage for their broken spirits. "We failed," Kenji said, his voice hollow. "We lived while our nation fell." The guards, to their credit, did not celebrate. They maintained their routines. Roll call, meals, work details, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The Red Cross began preparations for repatriation, compiling lists and arranging transport. Medical exams ensured the men were fit for the journey. New uniforms were issued, clean but still marked PW. The prisoners packed their meager belongings, letters, small carvings, a few keepsakes bought with canteen scrip, each item a reminder of a captivity that had reshaped them. The day of departure came in late 1945, a gray morning heavy with frost. The prisoners lined up outside the barracks, bundles in hand, their faces a mix of relief and dread. They had survived, but at what cost? As they boarded trucks to the train station, Hiroshi glanced back at the camp, its barracks and towers fading into the mist. He thought of the hamburger that had greeted him, the Coca-Cola that had burned his throat, the guard who had offered rice. These were not memories of cruelty, but of a humanity that confused him still. On the ship back to Japan, the men huddled in groups, sharing stories of home and fears of what awaited. Would they be welcomed as survivors or shunned as cowards? The sea stretched endless before them, a mirror to their uncertainty. When they finally reached Japan, the reality was worse than they had feared. Cities lay in ruins, blackened by fire and bombs. Families greeted them with tears, some of joy, others of accusation. Takeshi found his wife alive but frail, their home reduced to rubble. "You ate while we starved," she whispered, not unkindly, but with a truth that cut deep. Hiroshi's mother embraced him, but her eyes held questions he couldn't answer. Kenji, whose family had perished in a raid, stood alone on the docks, clutching a letter he had written but never sent. The prisoners carried their stories in silence, the taste of hamburgers and Coca-Cola lingering like a ghost. Some spoke later, in hushed tones, of an enemy who fed them, clothed them, and followed rules they hadn't believed existed. Others buried the memories, too ashamed to admit that captivity had been kinder than war. The legacy of Camp McCoy and camps like it lies not in grand battles but in the quiet moments that defied expectation. A guard's nod, a child's apple, a meal that nourished more than bodies. For the Japanese prisoners, these experiences were a paradox, proof that even in war humanity could persist, that kindness could wound as deeply as cruelty. As Takeshi told his son years later, sitting by a rebuilt hearth, I learned that an enemy can feed you, can heal you, can see you as a man, and that truth is harder to carry than any defeat. The war ended, but the questions it raised lived on, etched in the memories of men who expected torture and found hamburgers instead.